What's up, slackers? Welcome to Book Cheats. We finally made it to the final chapter of The Great Gatsby. That took a freaking long time. For today's featured tie, I'm wearing a brown Superba tie. And before I get into the chapter, I just want to thank you guys so much. I'm only 5 away from 1,000 subscribers, and by the time this video gets out, I'm sure I'll be past the 1,000 mark. And it's all thanks to you guys. And I promise to keep cranking out these summaries. This week, I'm also going to post a 1,000 subscriber thank you. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about The Great Gatsby Chapter 9. So, at the beginning of this chapter, it's actually 2 years after all the events of the rest of the book. Nick reflects on what happened after they found the body, and he says that it's still clear in his mind. Nick says that one of the officers came to the scene of the crime and saw Wilson's body and declared madman. The line was catchy, and so most of the news reports were titled Madman. Nick says that most of the news reports were really ridiculous and completely untrue when they first came out. And later, these reporters got the testimony of Michaelius, who talked about the possible affair. And Nick said that he thought the reports were going to turn towards a romantic love story and become ridiculous in that way. But Nick says that he's surprised that they didn't, because when news reporters interviewed Catherine, Myrtle's sister, Catherine lied and stood up for her sister and said that Myrtle never cheated on her husband and that she was a good wife. In the end, the stories of Gatsby's death panned out to being just a madman who randomly killed Gatsby. Nick sort of took it upon himself to see that Gatsby's body was taken care of and that people showed up to the funeral. Nick tried to call Daisy and Tom several times, but they had already packed up all their stuff and left town before any of this stuff went down. Nick tried to call Mr. Wolfsheim, but he couldn't find any information on him, and when he called Mr. Wolfsheim's office, he had already gone home. The next day, Nick sent a letter to Mr. Wolfsheim letting him know what happened, and Nick asked Mr. Wolfsheim to come on the next train so that he could help him with Gatsby's funeral. Later that day, Nick got a letter from Mr. Wolfsheim that said that he was deeply sorry, but that he was much too busy to deal with things about Gatsby's funeral.
Not my problem.
And he asked Nick to let him know when the funeral was. Mr. Wolfsheim also mentioned in the letter that he didn't know anything about Gatsby's family. Nick sort of felt like it was him and Gatsby against the world, because nobody was helping him at all. Later that day, a long-distance call came from Chicago, and Nick expected it to be Daisy and Tom. He picked up the phone, and it was some guy named Slagle. Slagle kept rambling on as if he was talking to Gatsby. By the way, Nick is at Gatsby's house trying to take care of things, and that's why he picks up Gatsby's phone. Slagle picks up the phone, and he starts rambling as if he's talking to Gatsby. And Nick interrupts him and says that Gatsby's dead. Slagle on the other line stops, and then randomly hangs up the phone. Finally, on the 3rd day of Nick trying to get a hold of people, a telegram came in from Minnesota. The telegram was signed Henry C. Gatz. It was Gatsby's father. The telegram read to postpone the funeral until he got there. Henry Gatz, or Gatsby's father, finally got there, and Nick described him as a frail old man who was weakened by grief. Gatsby's father said that he saw the news headlines from the Chicago paper, and as soon as he knew, he desperately tried to get a hold of somebody who knew Gatsby. Gatsby's father asked where Jimmy's at. If you remember, Gatsby's name used to be James Gatz, and Jimmy is a nickname for James. Nick took him to the drawing room where Gatsby was at, and he left Gatsby's father and Gatsby's body alone. After a few moments, Gatsby's dad came out, and there were clear signs that he had been crying, and he stopped and looked around the house at what Gatsby had built. Gatsby's father was filled with a sense of pride at the accomplishments of his son. Nick asked Mr. Gatz if he's going to take the body west to Gatsby's hometown. Gatsby's father says that they should bury the body there, because Gatsby liked the East Coast a lot better than the West. And that's where Gatsby had established his name. After a little bit more conversation, Gatsby's dad goes into one of the rooms and instantly falls asleep on one of the beds, overcome with grief. Nick had been trying to contact people to let them know about the funeral that was going to happen the next day at 3 p.m. when he finally got a call. The person who called was named Clip Springer. Nick was happy to finally have somebody call back. Nick asked if Clip Springer was going to come to the funeral, and Clip Springer said that he was going to try, and after some conversation, it wasn't clear what his motives were. And finally, Clip Springer said that he wasn't able to make it, but that he left some tennis shoes at Gatsby's house and was wondering if they could ship it to him. Nick was so upset at this guy's disrespect for Gatsby that he hung up the phone on him. The next day before the funeral, Nick drives to New York to try to get a hold of Mr. Wolfsheim. He heads into Mr. Wolfsheim's office and nobody's in there. And so Nick starts to shout to try to get a hold of somebody. Finally, the office lady comes out and she informs Nick that Mr. Wolfsheim wasn't in town. But Nick listens and he can hear Mr. Wolfsheim speaking in the back. He tells the woman that he can clearly hear Mr. Wolfsheim speaking and that he was there about Gatsby. The woman finally gives in and gets Mr. Wolfsheim. Mr. Wolfsheim invites Nick to sit down at lunch with him, and he tells Nick that he's the one who made Gatsby rich. Mr. Wolfsheim says that he took Gatsby out of the gutters and put him into riches. Nick tells Wolfsheim that Gatsby was his closest friend and that he needs to come to the funeral. Mr. Wolfsheim says that he's not going to be able to make it to the funeral, and he says that when his friends die, he doesn't like to get mixed up in that type of thing.
Right after you suck on these little Chinese nuts!
Nick is upset and he gets up to leave, and Mr. Wolfsheim says that you should support your friends while they're alive and leave them alone while they're dead. Nick was upset and left and headed back to the Gatsby's house to get ready for the funeral. When he got back to the house, Mr. Gatz, Gatsby's dad, was walking back and forth excitedly for Nick to get back. Gatsby's dad showed Nick a picture of Gatsby's house that Gatsby had sent him, and it was clear that he had shown that picture to a lot of people to show off his son's accomplishments. Gatsby's dad talked about how proud he was of his son and what a good kid he was, and he tells about how he and his wife were super sad when Gatsby ran off. He says that after Gatsby made his wealth, he bought his parents a house. Mr. Gatz pulls out an old book from Gatsby's childhood called Hop Along Cassidy. He flips to the back page where Gatsby had written a schedule when he was really young. Gatsby had written a schedule of his daily activities and his goals for the day. Gatsby's dad proudly says that Gatsby was always going somewhere and that Gatsby was always destined for greatness. The time came for the funeral and it was raining outside. Nick and Mr. Gatz looked outside to see if anybody was coming, and nobody was outside. They asked the Lutheran minister to wait 30 more minutes to see if anybody would come, and nobody showed. They proceeded with the funeral procession with only 3 cars. The hearse, a limo with Gatsby's dad, Nick, and the Lutheran minister, and a station wagon with some of Gatsby's servants. When they got to the funeral home, Nick was surprised to see the owl man from one of the earlier chapters, the one that had thought the books were cardboard, who was really drunk at one of the parties, there at the funeral. Somebody mentioned that blessed are the dead who get rained on, and Owlman said amen to that. They left for their cars, and Owlman apologized for not showing up sooner. Nick told him that nobody showed up, and Owlman said, the poor son of a bitch. Nick changes the tone of the chapter, and he talks about how people from the Midwest sort of have a disadvantage living on the East Coast. He says that his favorite memory was around Christmas time with all the snow and all the Christmas cheer, and a part of him would always be from the Midwest. The reason why he mentions this is because he says that after Gatsby's death, the East sort of haunted him, and he decided to move home. But before he left, he wanted to settle things with Jordan. Nick meets up with Jordan and starts to talk to her about how he's moving away, and he wanted to sort of settle things because he felt like they had unfinished business. Jordan sort of lies and says that she's engaged. Nick says that he knew that she was lying, but it could have been true because she was so pretty and so cool and so many guys were after her. After some awkward silence, Nick gets up to leave because Jordan isn't really talking back to him. As Nick gets up to leave, Jordan finally speaks, and she says that what Nick did by being rude to her on the phone really hurt her feelings. She said that she was over it now, but after she hung up on him, she felt dizzy for a while. Jordan reminds Nick of a conversation they had where Nick told her that a bad driver doesn't get into trouble until they meet another bad driver. And she says that Nick is that other bad driver that she met. She sort of whiningly tells Nick that she thought his honesty was his virtue. The last thing that Nick says to Jordan before he leaves is that he's 5 years too old to call his honesty honor. He turns and leaves. Nick says that they are both still half in love with each other, but he needed to get out of town. Nick changes the tone of the chapter again and talks about something that happened while he was at home in October after the events that had all happened. Nick says that he was walking in downtown Minnesota and he saw Tom walking too. Nick tried to avoid Tom, but Tom eventually turned and saw Nick and rushed up to shake his hand. Nick wouldn't shake his hand, and Tom was sort of shocked. And asked why Nick wouldn't shake his hand. Nick asked Tom what he told George that night. Nick knows that George called Tom to figure out who was driving the yellow car, and he knows that Tom directed him in the path of Gatsby. Tom was shocked that Nick had guessed about him talking to George. Tom stepped forward and forcibly grabbed Nick's hand, and he says that he told George the truth. Tom says that he felt bad about what he did, but he says that Gatsby had it coming for running over Myrtle. Nick says that he finally realizes that Daisy and Tom were actually perfect for each other because they were both cowards who just hid in their wealth anytime a problem arose. Nick shook Tom's hand back, but he says that he felt like he was shaking the hand of a child. Nick ends the book by flashing back to his last experience he had on the East Coast before he went to Minnesota. He says the night before he left, he went to Gatsby's backyard and he sort of reminisced about all the things that had happened there. He says that he walks down to the beach and looks across the bay and sees the green light that Gatsby used to stare at. Nick says that he imagines that Gatsby felt like he could have reached out and grabbed his goal, and that it was so real that he could just grab it. Nick says that what Gatsby didn't realize is that his dream was in the past, that it was always impossible for him to accomplish. And Nick says that men will keep running and running after their dreams with their arms stretched out. And the last line in the book says, "So we beat on, boats against the currents, borne back ceaselessly into the past." Basically, he's saying even though a lot of people chase their dreams and some people fail, he's encouraging people to continue to fight against the waves and to continue to fight for their dreams. And that concludes the book. Thanks so much for watching Book Cheats. Please leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions from your homework, please leave a comment down below and I'll get to it as soon as I can. Look out for my 1,000 subscriber thank you video. And you guys should check out my website. It's mybookcheats.com. That's where I post the text for all of my summaries, and I also post my videos. I'm going to keep working on it to make it awesome. And you can also follow me on Twitter. And I usually tweet every day, trying to get into that, and eventually I'll add more social media stuff. So you guys have an awesome day and slack on.